How many lives lost so far in Bakhmut and why? Today, Russia claims to have fully captured the eastern Donbas city, while Ukraine spins it as part of the plan, its forces elsewhere gaining ground to the north and the south. Kyiv long claimed that the eastern Donbas city merely represented a symbolic trophy, but it also decided to duke it out. We'll ask why Bakhmut matters and what next after Volodymyr Zelensky's barnstorming tours, first of European capitals, taking him all the way to the G7 summit, and some lobbying for yet more support in Japan as it gets heated back home. On that note, we'll be asking our panel about those mysterious skirmishes taking place just over the border inside Russia, north of Kyiv. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking why Bakhmut matters. Joining us from Odessa, Hannah Shalest, Director of Security Programs at the Ukraine Prism think tank. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
From Washington, Melinda Herring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
George Kuzmanovich is the president of the Sovereign Republic, République Souveraine political party. Thanks for being with us as well.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
And from Geneva, security analyst Alexandre Vautravert, who teaches at the University of Geneva, editor-in-chief of the French language Swiss Military Review. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Before we go to our panel, let's first go to Kramatorsk. That's 20 kilometers west of the frontline city of Bakhmut. France 24 senior correspondent Catherine Norris Trent is there. Catherine, tell us about your Monday.
Good evening, Francois. Well, we started the day by going filming with one of the Ukrainian brigades, which is on the flanks of Bakhmut, and trying to regain ground. They told us they'd managed to gain 4 square kilometers in recent weeks, that it had been hard going, that they'd lost quite a lot of men, they'd lost quite a lot of machinery as well as ammunition, but they'd managed to make a localized push around the edge of Bakhmut onto some high ground from which they are now planning to fire relentlessly down on the Russians camped out in Bakhmut. So they say, as far as they're concerned, Ukraine's mission in Bakhmut has been accomplished, and that now they are going to unleash as much firepower as they can. One Ukrainian soldier telling me it was going to be like a bone that's stuck in the throat. So they are surveying the Russian positions, of course, with drone technology. It's been very much a big part of this conflict, and trying to keep mounting these quite limited counteroffensive, but trying to keep gaining ground in that area if they at all can.
You've been spending time over the past week in the south of the country as well. How does the mood compare to where you are now? Bakhmut, of course, has been branded a meat grinder compared to the World War I Battle of Verdun.
Absolutely. And just looking at some of the images that the brigade we were filming with, their satellite images, their drone images, I mean, just the scale of the destruction is absolutely unbelievable. And even there, you know, on the edges of the city, the artillery fire is constant, incoming and outgoing. That battle's still very much raging on the edge of the city, even if the Wagner Group and Russia claims they've taken the urban areas. Of course, Ukraine's still saying they hold on to a pocket of that. I mean, it's impossible to actually confirm on the ground to get in. They've been holding on to just a tiny sliver of land themselves. So this has been just the most intense battle of this war since Russia's full-scale invasion. I mean, there are fierce battles going along this 900-kilometre front line further south in the city of Avdiivka, which is surrounded on 3 sides. We were also down on the Zaporizhia front line, where there's really incessant shelling and aviation bombing too. But I think the Ukrainians had been hoping that they told us to keep going in Bakhmut for as long as they can, to try and draw as much Russian firepower there as possible to perhaps save some of the other areas of these front lines.
Catherine Norris Trent reporting live from Kramatorsk. Many thanks for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Yeah, it was the head of the Wagner paramilitaries who released a video Saturday outside Bakhmut train station. This is some 3 kilometers from the western front of the city.
20 мая 23 года.
It's May 20, 2023, 2005, 2023. This afternoon at midday, Bakhmut was completely taken, the last section of the so-called symbolic district.
And you can hear the sound of artillery in the background. Hannah Celeste, it's not a victory, although Ukraine claiming it's all part of the strategy. When it's the head of Wagner holding that Russian flag in the center of the city.
You know, first of all, that is the matter of interpretation, because Mr. Prigozhin have already spoke, I don't know how many times, that he took control over the whole city of Bakhmut. We heard it since July last year. We already in May next year, and there are still fighting at some of the streets. Also, can you claim the full control of the city if you don't control the perimeter of the city? It's not even the part victory, it is just control of the several streets that are absolutely destroyed, because the city is definitely absolutely destroyed. As for now, it's not as the occupation of Kherson or Melitopol previously that been really as they occupied. So that's why the situation is changing. We understand that most of the city territory, Wagner Group and Russian forces are controlling. We don't have confirmation yet that they control the whole city, because I checked the different military chats today, and there are some information that some of the streets at the suburbs are still under the Ukrainian forces' control. And definitely, as we know, it is semi-encircled. So in these conditions, the situation can again flash back to the Russians and change even more. But what your journalist said is absolutely right, that Bakhmut, first of all, is important because of those forces Russia needed to accumulate for its defense or counter-offense. And in this case, we can have less fighting in other cities and other kilometers of the front line.
You agree with that assessment, Josh Kuzmanovich?
Yeah, I agree. It's a matter of interpretation. Obviously, Bakhmut is considered as a victory by the Russian side. We're celebrating it a lot. But although I'm not sure of its strategic importance.
As a gateway to Kramatorsk, where Catherine Norris Trent is now?
Well, I consider all this push and go back for a few kilometers are completely secondary if we consider the overall war. And now it's a long war in which we are, and everything that will count is the human potential, the capacity of industrial, military mass production, and logistics. So, yeah, it's maybe a victory. I'm not sure that the Ukrainians should have stayed in Bakhmut because it was completely surrounded by the Russians, so they had a lot of losses. The strategic, it's not really strategic, but the battle lasted 9 months, so it confers to that battle a kind of symbolic aspect. And that's why I think that today you had this small operation inside Russia near Belgorod, because you fight in symbol with another. So yeah, it's a momentum of the war, but the war will continue, I think.
I want to get to what's going on in Belgorod in a moment, because it's our correspondent in Kyiv was saying it's what everybody's talking about in Ukraine. But first, let me turn to you first, Alexandre Vautravers. Why, again, I know the question's been asked a million times, but why did Russia make a point of trying to seize the city of Bakhmut, and why did Ukraine decide to fight it out?
Well, several answers to your question. First of all, there was an original battle in Bakhmut. It was not called Bakhmut at the time in 2014, and this has a lot of symbolic value for the Russians. Also, the fact that the major city of Kherson was lost by the Russians because their own generals evacuated, pulled out from the city, meant that it was necessary to put some pressure and obtain a territorial gain in the form of a major city. So definitely for the Russians, the intentions were extremely clear. And as we have heard, for Ukraine, I would say that for a number of months, the differential, the ratio of Russian losses to own Ukrainian losses was relatively favorable. You quoted the historic example of Verdun. So yes, definitely there was some arithmetic that was done. But we know also that in the last 4 months, the Ukrainians were losing as many soldiers as the Russians, and this was no longer sustainable. So I think what we should expect now is for the Russian troops for the next 3 or 4, perhaps even more weeks, to consolidate this city. This means several tens of thousands of Russian soldiers are going to get into the city and fortify the city. And this is perhaps an opportunity for a Ukrainian counterattack. There is this military acronym FFFF. So you find the enemy, you fix the enemy, for example, in a city like Bakhmut, you flank the enemy, and then you fight.
So what do you make of the head of the Wagner mercenaries announcing that he was establishing defensive positions for a handover to Russian regular forces by June the 1st?
It's not surprising because the Wagner units, which are regimental units, have been essentially injected in the front line in order to resolve a number of tactical difficulties. And so these Wagner mercenary units are essentially firefighters. They are engaged in a specific area, and then they will move to another hotspot on the front line. And so there's probably no real reason for them to stay on in this consolidation phase of the operation.
Melinda Herring, for you, why does Bakhmut matter?
Because what Hannah said, it was meant to hold Russian forces in place and to wear down their numbers. If you talk to NATO officials, they'll say at one point 5 Russian soldiers were dying as 1 Ukrainian soldier was dying. So the ratio was very disproportionate. If you look at the numbers, the U.S. says that 100,000 Russian soldiers died over the last 5 months, or sorry, 100,000 Russian casualties, 20,000 dead over the last 5 months. It was a meat grinder. It was meant to keep the Russians in place, wear them down, but it's also not much of a victory. So we know that the Russians wanted to take Bakhmut by May Day, and they didn't do that. They haven't had a victory in nearly a year. So based on the numbers, I think this was Ukraine's way of showing the world how impotent the Russian army really is.
And now we have what you were just describing a moment ago, George Kuzmanovich. You're calling it a counterfire. In any case, we don't quite know yet what's going on. What we do know is that Moscow is claiming that a Ukrainian, quote, a Ukrainian sabotage group had crossed the border as a diversion from the taking of Bakhmut. The governor of the southern Belgorod region stating that troops and members of the security services were fighting a group. Now, it's apparently 2 different militias. The Ukrainians are claiming that these are Russian nationals who are fighting. One of the groups, a Russian nationalist group, the other made up of deserters and those who are against Vladimir Putin more generally. Hannah Shelest fighting reportedly around 3 villages. What's going on just north of Kharkiv on the other side of the Russian border?
Definitely, we have very diverse information coming from the ground, both from the Russian and Ukrainian side. We see in the social networks a lot of the small videos. First of all, what we have is a confirmation that there is no Ukrainian citizens or Ukrainian armed forces participating in these activities. Otherwise, it will be the act of aggression. We have the 2 Russian groups made of Russian citizens. And definitely, this line is quite important because a lot of the offenses against the city of Kharkiv Kharkiv has been happening exactly from this territory. The official proclaimed by these groups goal is to make a certain demilitarized group or gray zone, so to minimize the attacks. Understandable that Russia has much more places from where to attack the city of Kharkiv, but also let's not forget that in Belgorod it is the nuclear storage facilities for the nuclear weapons. And what Russians currently are really afraid of, at least what we can see from their social networks and from the local media discussions, that they started evacuating these nuclear storage facilities. Probably looking at all the pictures that we see now. But it is one very interesting moment that we need to remember. For example, in 1918, Belgorod was a city in Ukraine. That was a Ukrainian territory. And a lot of the villages at the border, there were villages that in 1954 was given to Russian Federation. So the same act when Russia is claimed that Crimea was gifted to Ukraine, the same documents made with those villages, gifting them to Russia.
All right, so there may be mixed loyalties in the area. Alexandre Vautravers, have you made any sense of this? This is still a breaking news story.
Well, as a former military intelligence officer, I would say this is typically an information operation from the Ukrainian side, because if you have a military tactical victory of Russia, however discreet and however minor it might be, it is important in the news to demonstrate that there is something happening in the other direction. I think what we're witnessing now is all sorts of shaping operations. You have heard about a week ago that there were some offensive operations in the area of Zaporizhzhia, that there were attempted crossings of the Dnieper River. So what we are seeing is really a lot of information that is coming out in order to make the Russians hesitate. Where is the counterattack, the Ukrainian counterattack, going to come?
George Kuzmanovic?
I agree completely with Mr. Vautravers. And once again, it would be smart from the Ukrainians to counterbalance a symbolic defeat in Bakhmut with this attack on the Russian territory. The one point I do not agree is the death toll on the Ukrainian side. Everybody in the West is saying that Russians are losing much more soldiers.
You're talking about Bakhmut here.
Bakhmut and on all the front. I'm not sure of this. Obviously, we know exactly what are the Russian losses, but we are not unable to know what are the Ukrainian losses, and it's completely closed information. And as you journalist said, when you have report on the field, people saying that they lost a lot of soldiers and material. And from my point of analysis, I think that Russians are trying to kill a lot of Ukrainian soldiers and destroy material. That's their tactics now. And I think that's what they did in Bakhmut. And from a military point of view, I don't know what the Ukrainian state in Bakhmut they could have done as the Russian in Kherson. Kherson was very difficult to defend. It was surrounded by three sides, only one road, which was the situation in Bakhmut. Yeah, it's more smart to push on the south and the north of Bakhmut to encircle the city, but stay in the city under the heavy artillery fire. And I remind you that the Russians have a strength in the army is the artillery. So, yeah, it was, I think, unfortunately, a lot of casualty for not much for Ukraine.
But you heard Melinda Herring talking earlier about how you and also Alexandre Vautravers, you pin down the enemy in an area. But
yes, but that's what the Russians did with the Ukrainians during 9 months.
Melinda Herring?
So I politely disagree. And if you go and look at Michael Weiss reporting, he's talked to some Ukrainian generals, and there was unanimity. They did not disagree whatsoever from Zelensky all the way down. They thought that Bakhmut had to be defended for strategic reasons, to show how weak the Russian army was, and also to bleed them out before the counteroffensive. And I think with time, that decision will probably be proven true. One other bit on the Russia news, though, that's interesting that came out. Hannah's exactly right, but there's also another video that came out today. A top Ukrainian general has said in Russian, he told all Russian soldiers, you can live if you give yourself up. So in addition to what we're seeing in Russia proper, and the Ukrainians are saying something very clever. They're saying it wasn't us, but we're studying it very carefully. I think these are shaping operations, and we're going to see more of them, and they're meant to throw people off balance. So I expect to see many more items like this in the coming weeks.
It's so much an information war that you wonder, Melinda Herring, if we're really heading towards this much vaunted counteroffensive, or if it's just going to keep on being a grind through spring and summer.
So go back and remember last fall. The Ukrainians were brilliant. They kept saying counteroffensive, counteroffensive, counteroffensive all last summer, and you and I kept looking for it. And they made so much noise about it that they were able to convince, they made so much noise about Kherson that the Russians moved their troops and exposed the north, and they were able to take Kharkiv. I don't know when the Ukrainians are going to do it. No one knows this, but the Ukrainians are going to be looking for a soft, easy place to push through, and the Russians have a hell of a lot of a long line to defend. So there will be weaknesses, and we know the Ukrainians are going to exploit them. But we also know that public opinion is a finicky thing, and my country, the United States, has elections in 2024. I'm not concerned about Europe. I think something massively changed in Europe in the last 2 weeks. Europe is not only united, I think it's stronger than ever when it comes to Ukraine. Public opinion in the United States, though, is a tricky thing, and if Donald Trump is the GOP nominee, we're in trouble, or we may be in trouble here when it comes to Ukraine support. So far, it's okay, but there's definitely reason to be concerned.
Yes, if I may add, you know that the last great Ukrainian offensive was made against less than 200,000 Russian soldiers. Now there are far more, and there are far more vehicles and aircraft on the front. The other thing is that during this offensive, the Ukrainians, they had their old Soviet material, which they were used to, and they had a lot of shells and things, materials. Now it's a lot of different materials. It's complicated to coordinate. And they have, in front of them, they have much more Russian soldiers that prepared, as you know perfectly, in deep 20, 30, 40 kilometers in deep defense. This will be costly if they launch an offensive. And especially because Ukraine, they don't have air support, and if you do an offensive without air support, well, it's very hard, I think.
A couple of points in there, and I'll put it to Hannah Shales first. First off, that 900-kilometer border is long for both sides. Secondly, you heard George Kuzmanovich saying the Russians can afford to deplete and to bomb stuff at this point in time. Your thoughts on that?
Yes and no. The problem is that, first of all, Russians are producing much less of the ammunition that they had in the beginning of the war. So what they could afford last year or even in the autumn, it's not what they can afford now. Also, as you can see, most of their newcomers, it is the newly mobilized that is not well trained. Even the Wagner group that's been so much professional and skillful last year and now is predominantly composed from the prisoners. So definitely not the same type of the personnel. Also their supply. If you see to the Ukrainian tactic within the last few months, and especially the last ones, there were numerous attacks on the long range against the oil depots, ammunition depots, and even this week in many cities, starting from Berdyansk, Melitopol, Novakhovka, all around, even Mariupol, you have the heavy explosions at the ammunition depots. So Ukraine understands the asymmetry. That's why before making any personal offense, we are doing the offense against the supply line and logistics. Plus, why logistics, the railway. Russians still have very long leg to any type of the logistics that they need. Their last week attack against the railway in Crimea stopped a lot of the supply to the Kherson region for the defense that they needed over there. So at the same time, Ukraine started to receive more and more sophisticated weapons. And that is important because you can have 25 of the old Soviet missiles that are not reaching their goal, and you have one Patriot system. What will be more effective in this case? So Ukrainians are quite good in using these new weapons that we are receiving.
Alexandre Vautravers, is that the case? It is all kinds of different weapon systems and pieces of equipment that are being pledged.
It's true up to a certain point because many of these different equipments, what you're seeing is the Leopard 2, which I served 30 years on. Many of these systems are interoperable. And so as long as you have a common logistics chain, most of the ammunition is going to be compatible. And the philosophy of how these systems function is quite similar. There's also a system of engagement logistics or combat logistics that have been put in place, which is very similar to NATO. So each Ukrainian brigade is sort of grandfathered by a certain NATO country, and this allows for a very direct support. To answer your question, I would say within a year, Russia is going to face more and more serious trouble because in terms of personnel, it can field more troops, but very much untrained troops and lack of cadre or lack of experienced non-commissioned officers and cadre and commanders is already a problem today. We're seeing it in the field. With regards to ammunition, the capacity of Russian industry to produce ammunition is not limitless, and it is not able to fulfill its obligations today. And with regards to military equipment, whether we're talking about airplanes or tanks, the Russian industry is not able to make good the losses. So we may be in a situation in about 6 to 12 months where Russian combat aircraft are not going to be flying anymore, where cruise missiles or sophisticated system are not available anymore to the Russian armed forces. And what we're seeing is that the Russians are more and more obliged to be on the defensive.
Well, that brings us back to Melinda Herring's point. There seems to be this crucial moment right now where if the Ukrainians don't want to be fighting beyond 2024 in case of the return of an isolationist U.S. president, Volodymyr Zelensky has to lobby for more help, and he's done so, gradually edging towards Ukraine's goal of new fighter jets to win the battle of the skies. And after the Arab League summit in Saudi Arabia, the Ukrainian president this past weekend traveling aboard a French presidential plane to Hiroshima, where he stated his case before G7 leaders. And after France and the UK, the U.S. pledging to train Ukrainian pilots on F-16 fighter jets.
I told them the United States, together with our allies and partners, is going to begin training Ukrainian pilots in fourth-generation fighter aircraft, including F-16s, to strengthen Ukraine's Air Force as part of a long-term commitment to Ukraine's ability to defend itself.
Of course, Melinda Herring, it takes a while to train a pilot. Has that training already begun?
So there were 2 Ukrainian pilots who came to the United States, and the Pentagon had said that it would take 18 months, 18 months, to train Ukrainian pilots. And that turned out to be nonsense. An Air Force assessment came out last week, and the 2 Ukrainian pilots who came over were able to learn how to operate F-16s in 4 months. So this was just a political stall technique. The White House did not want to give F-16s, but then they got caught with egg on their face. And, you know, Europe has woken up and wants to put together this coalition of fighter jets. So this is a broader point. It's part of the discussion you guys were just having. We continue to underestimate Ukrainians and underestimate their technical capabilities. We've seen this over and over again with complex weapon systems. Ukrainians are motivated and they have high technical education, and they can learn very, very quickly.
A coalition of fighter jets, Hannah Celeste, but it's based on the F-16.
Yes, it is based on F-16, but it is very practical and pragmatic decision because that is the type of the aircraft that been mostly produced. So there are a lot of them available already on the ground. They are not so difficult in learning how to use. So they're definitely sophisticated, but they are not something that you cannot learn how to do after the Soviet types. Also because there is sufficient ammunition, and that is that type of the radar systems that Ukraine needs as for now against the Su-35 that Russians are using, and also because many countries has them. So with some weapons, you are going only to the United States, and that has its limits. That's why it is always better when you can find something, and now we see that the Netherlands, the Denmark, of other countries. So we already have at least 5-6 countries that are ready to deliver and to teach Ukrainians how to use F-16. So that makes the supply easier, as Ukraine needs at least several escadrilles. So each one approximately of 12 aircraft, and we need 4 or 5 to be effective with them. So 48, at least 56 of the airplanes, that's something what you need to find in different countries as soon as possible. And also don't forget that a lot of countries are now changing their F-16 to the newer types of the aircrafts. And that's why many of them are eager to deliver them to other countries, and especially when it is for the good purpose like Ukrainian defense.
Alexandre Vautravers, we see that the Russians, who have a sizable air force, have only used a small portion of it so far. Part of the problem is you don't want to venture out if you don't control what's going on in terms of anti-aircraft batteries. You don't want to wade into fire when you're a pilot. So if the Ukrainians get these F-16s, you heard earlier George Kuzmanovich saying that the Russians are good at artillery. It would be for what exactly?
Well, if you look at the capabilities of air defense of Ukraine today, these capabilities are rapidly dwindling, not because the systems that are in use, either ex-Soviet systems or Western systems, it's not that these systems are not good, but we are rapidly seeing the ammunition stocks of these guided weapons, these sophisticated weapons, being depleted. The West has handed a certain number of systems, limited numbers of systems, but we see that the ranges of Western systems are substantially lower than the former Soviet types. So one of the possible uses of the F-16 is really to sort of plug in the holes and essentially the high altitude, long range capabilities that the Western systems do not have, because Western countries rely mainly on aircraft in order to perform counter-air missions. So this is definitely one of the essential roles of these F-16s. And I would add, other types of aircraft can also perform this air deterrence, this air defense mission. Mm-hmm. And they do that for as long as we have not reached the critical mass. We've heard something like 40 airplanes. I would say that even with a smaller number of these airplanes, you can already perform quite a bit in the area of air defense. But I think that we need to think a little bit further. And Ukraine has received a number of air-to-ground weapons, pinpoint, precise, guided munitions that may have a very substantial role to play in interdiction missions, shaping the battlefield, striking the command centers and logistical supply routes of the Russian forces.
George Kuzmanovich, we heard Emmanuel Macron signing on to train those Ukrainian pilots. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we don't have F-16s in the French army, so I don't know on which plane they will train them. I consider it will be a suicide. First, Ukraine is a country, technical, they're producing planes, warplanes, and they still has plane. But their problem is that they cannot fly above 100 feet. And why so?
Sorry, above what?
Yeah, the actual airplanes are attacking on the ground, and they cannot fly above 100 feet because they're exposed to anti-aircraft missiles from Russia. And as you perfectly know, Russia has developed and mass-developed a mass production of S-400 anti-ballistic missile system, surface-to-air missiles. And now their own army has the S-500 called Prometheus. And already in Syria, for NATO airplanes, if S-40 were deployed, it was a no-flight zone because it's almost sure that it will be a destruction because this system are hypersonic well, it's suicide. So it's quite complicated. I mean, 40 or 50 planes is absolutely not enough compared to what the amount of S-40 and S-400 and S-500 Russia can put in line against them.
Hannah Celeste, your reaction?
First of all, Russians are using most of the S-300, S-400 against the land targets. For example, the city of Kherson being targeted, or Zaporizhia predominantly from this. So Russians are using very often their weapons not for the goal it was made. The second is, at least was our pilots being explained. The question is that these airplanes, F-16, is needed exactly for the air defense. Russians are using a lot of the ammunition, missiles from their airplanes, and considering the system that MiGs have, what we have as for now, they need to come very, very close to the Russians' airplanes to intercept it, and that is dangerous. That is suicide. F-16 has a different system that allows not to come that close. They just need to be in the airspace, and they can intercept when these attacks are happening. For example, Odessa is targeted a lot from the airplanes that start in the Caspian. They are not coming closer. So with the S-400 system, because Russians are not using S-500 in Ukraine, you also need to understand where they are. So that is also the question, who in which range it is. It is not the Syrian situation where you had the mix of everybody on the ground. Here you have a certain limitations of the access of the Russian weapons and the necessity where Ukrainians at the first stage are ready to use F-16 as the air defense system, the complementary to the existing system.
As complementary to the existing system, the former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who served in both the Bush and Obama administrations, applauding the current U.S. president's coalition building when it comes to Ukraine in general, but telling U.S. network CBS over the weekend that the current president's been too slow to approve those F-16s.
I understand the need to avoid a direct confrontation with the Russians. But I think we learned pretty early on that as long as we weren't providing things that could attack Russia proper, that Putin was not going to retaliate.
Well, there was just this report, the Ukrainians and then U.S. officials confirmed that it was a U.S. Patriot missile system that shot down some Russian jets over Russian airspace. That's significant.
Yes, but if they launch it from Russian airspace, then they have to be prepared to have the remains fall on the Russian territory.
So, Melinda Herring, that's an allusion to what happened, 9-10 days ago, 2 planes, 2 Russian helicopters going down, 4 craft in all, deep inside Russian territory, Ukraine's military flagging the May 13th downing in the Bryansk region of Russia. You just heard there Robert Gates say it's legitimate to go after those Russian planes inside of Russian territory. You agree?
Absolutely. Francois, I'd say the expert community in Washington, both Republicans and Democrats, are firmly in favor of the F-16 decision and of give Ukraine all the weapons it needs to end this as soon as possible. But on that specific episode you just mentioned, of course, they have every right to use our Patriot systems to protect their people. So why shouldn't they do it?
Because wasn't the strings attached at the beginning that we don't want a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, and therefore we don't want it to be an attack on Russian soil, which Ukraine, by the way, repeatedly repeats that it's not attacking on Russian soil.
And they said that indeed today, when you look at what's happening on Russian soil, they said clearly it was not us. And they have said over and over again, Zelensky promised Biden that he would not use the F-16s on Russia proper. So the Ukrainians have been very careful in that deliberation. But look, it's not an act of war. They were preventing people from dying in Ukraine. I don't think it's illegal under any kind of international law. So I don't see the problem. The Ukrainians should use the weapon systems we give to protect their people.
Alexandre Vautravers, you agree?
Long story short, many of the Russian weapons are being released by aircraft or launched by terrestrial launchers several hundred kilometers from the border of Ukraine. So I think it's very much a specialist, a lawyer's discussion, if you want. It's very theoretical.
George Kuzmanovic?
Yeah, from the Ukrainian point of view, it's absolutely normal to defend its own country. So if they have to strike inside Russia or plane flying or missiles above Russia, well, I don't see why they should not do that to defend the country. But I think the problem is broader. Many people are saying why we didn't give Ukraine tanks and missiles and planes in the beginning of the war. Why? Not because Biden is stupid or Macron or Scholz are stupid people. Because we were convinced that we will defeat Russia on the economic ground very fast, which is not the case. And I do not
Wasn't
agree.
it more because Russia's a nuclear-armed country and they were afraid of a direct confrontation?
We cannot have a direct confrontation with Russia as we couldn't have with the Soviet Union. That's the 101 rule of modern war, because they have 6,000 nuclear weapons. So it's just not possible. Or maybe we can have a regime change, but it's not likely to happen very soon in Russia. So you cannot have a direct confrontation. But Ukraine can defend itself, even striking in Russia. And once again, I disagree with what was said. Russia is producing a lot of ammunition. They prepared it since 8 years. They are not like us, and they didn't consider that the economic victory will be very fast. Look at the preparation on the agricultural part of economy. It was strong, and it's one of the weapons they will use in the years to come. Because once again, this will be a long war, and hoping that they're just using old ammunitions, they cannot produce ammunition, that they not have people. It's very dangerous.
Hannah Celeste, your thoughts?
We are not saying that they cannot produce at all, but their production decreased at least in 3 times, and we see it by the intensity of the shelling. If you compare what's been even in October last year, the type of the ammunition that they use, the type of the missiles that they use, and the quantity that they used at once, it is absolutely not comparable to what's been the last several months. Now we experience the attacks each 2 weeks with at least 3 times less missiles of different configurations. So you can see 2 calibers, 2 Iskander, 2 other types, what is quite ineffective in this case. Also, they're not doing the mass attacks against the whole territory of Ukraine as they've been doing even in October, but they are choosing one city. One night it is Odessa, another night it is Kyiv, another night it is Dnipro. And they started using more and more of non-Russian ammunition. They are now searching for the possibilities to buy from Iran. We know that the new portion of Iranian drones just arrived a few days ago to the Russian Federation. If they are producing so wonderfully, they would not buy from the countries like Iran and not trying to buy something from North Korea or scratching in the stockpiles of the old Soviet sellings to Cambodia or to the African states. We need to understand that Russia has a technology, even that sometimes we have questions to these technologies, because, for example, for a lot of their strategic missiles, the engine being produced and manufactured in Ukraine. So the last they received 9 years ago and no maintenance. And that's about most of their nuclear strategic weapons. Also, most of their chips, or better say all their chips for the missiles, are not produced in the Russian Federation. They are now
searching them at all the black markets. The same is happening, like I can go to more and more details like this, but you can understand that it is not the endless they are producing. And with each month, we see less and less of the quality long-range missiles being produced in the Russian Federation.
Very briefly, because we're almost out of time, this counteroffensive, we've stopped predicting when it will happen, but one specific question that's interesting to all of Europe, I'll put it to you, Alexandre Vautravers. What happens around Europe's largest nuclear power plant, Zaporizhzhia? It's back up and running, but once again, power was out earlier, said the UN's nuclear watchdog.
Okay, I don't see necessarily a link between the counterattacks and the situation in Zaporizhzhia, but definitely on an operational level, what you want to try and do is mount an offensive in the south and try to cut off from their supply as many Russian troops, and necessarily there will be fighting in the area of Zaporizhzhia. That is something which is quite certain.
All right, something to keep an eye out, and something perhaps to certainly worry about every time the power goes down there. I want to thank you, Alexandre Vautravers, for joining us from Geneva. I want to thank as well Hannah Shelest in Odessa, Melinda Herring in Washington, George Kuzmanovic. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.